Few are ever invited, but tonight it is you. Step inside the Ink and Lantern Society, where shadows guard their secrets, but the dead still have stories to tell. Tonight, you will walk beside me through history's forbidden corridors, each dark truth waiting to be heard. Now that you've crossed our threshold, subscribe to descend deeper into our sacred crypts and confess in the comments below your favourite tale from history's gallows. Breathe slowly. Let the outer world fade. You are among the keepers now. This evening, our lantern light falls on the cobbled streets of long-ago Britain and the places where the dead did not rest easy. There is a comfort in believing the grave is final, that the earth once closed over a coffin seals a pact of peace between the living and the dead. But there was a time, not so long ago, when that pact could be broken for the right price. In the fog-bound lanes of Edinburgh, in the churchyards of London, in the quiet kirkyards of Aberdeen, and the ancient burial grounds of Dublin, there walked men who could, for the right sum, raise the dead. They were called many things: body snatchers, grave robbers, resurrection men. Tonight we will walk beside them. There is a comfort, isn't there, in believing the grave is final, that once the coffin is lowered, the lid sealed, and the soil smoothed, the matter is concluded. The dead belong to the earth, the living to the light. But there was a time, not so very far from our own, when the grave was more like a temporary lease than a lifelong home. In the right place at the right hour and for the right price, a man could be persuaded to dig, lift, and carry you away before the frost had even settled. Early 19th century Edinburgh was a city that wore the macabre like a second skin. Its ancient kirkyards, Greyfriars, Canongate, St Cuthbert's, pressed up against rows of tall, narrow tenements, the stones leaning like crooked teeth. By day, the grass market bustled with traders calling out prices for bread, cloth, and fish. By night, the streets shrank into shadow, the fog rolled thick and low, and the faint glow of a lantern in a churchyard meant one of two things. Someone was paying respects, or someone was about to profit. And in this city the dead could be worth more than the living. These were years of sickness as well as shadow. Edinburgh's overcrowded closes trapped the reek of human waste and smoke. Typhus spread easily. Cholera arrived in deadly waves. Smallpox scarred and stole the young. The graveyards filled steadily. And still, the medical schools wanted more. The University of Edinburgh's anatomy theatres were the envy of Europe, drawing students from London, Dublin, Paris, and even America. Men like Alexander Monroe II, famed for his lectures, could not hope to train their pupils without bodies to dissect. But the law was stubborn. Under the Murder Act of 1752, only the corpses of executed criminals could be used for dissection, a punishment meant to disgrace a man even after death. Problem was, the hangman's rope was seeing less and less use. In Scotland, some years saw fewer than a dozen executions. Far too few to keep the anatomy tables busy. And so others stepped forward to meet the demand. Men with quick hands, steady nerves, and a certain moral flexibility. Resurrection men. They worked in twos and threes, moving at night, favouring fog and frost to hide their work. In Edinburgh, a skilled crew could lift a body in under an hour, shovel through the fresh earth, pry the coffin lid just far enough to pull the body free by the shoulders, leaving coffin and clothing behind. The law punished theft of property after all, but not the removal of a corpse. At least, not in the way we'd think today. It was hard work, make no mistake. The soil was often heavy with winter rain. Coffins could splinter or stick. And of course, there was always the chance of being caught, or worse, mistaken for a common thief and beaten before you could explain. Some said it was the worst job in Edinburgh. Others said it was the best. At least the customers never complained. Greyfriars Kirkyard was among the most targeted. High walls kept out casual intruders, but not those who came prepared. And with the medical school only a short walk away, a fresh corpse could be on the dissecting table before dawn. Witnesses spoke of muffled grunts in the night, the scrape of wood on soil, and the soft but unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged over stone. In this city, graves were not sacred. They were simply storage, temporary, negotiable, and vulnerable to the knock of a spade in the cold dark. And that is where our journey begins. It begins, as many trades do, with supply and demand. And in this case, the supply was the human body. In Britain and Ireland at the close of the 18th century, medical teaching was on the rise. Surgeons were shedding the role of barber, stepping forward as learned men of science. Universities competed to fill their lecture theatres with eager students. Edinburgh's medical school drew pupils from as far as Philadelphia and Bombay. London's Guy's and St Thomas's hospitals expanded their anatomy classes. Dublin's Royal College of Surgeons refined its reputation. But there was a single problem common to them all. You cannot learn anatomy without a cadaver. And by law there was only one lawful source, the corpses of executed criminals. The Murder Act of 1752 had decreed that dissection would be a punishment in itself, reserved to add posthumous disgrace to the gallows. At first, this seemed enough. In the mid-18th century, executions were frequent, a grim parade of theft, forgery, and murder that ended at the rope. But by the early 1800s, hanging had fallen from favour for all but the most serious crimes. Scotland might see a dozen executions in a year. London perhaps a few more. That barely stocked the anatomy tables for a single term. Scarcity may drive innovation, but in this case, it also drove men to the grave. By 1800, the shortage was so acute that students would jostle for a place in the front row, hoping to see an entire dissection before the body decayed. Preservation techniques were primitive. The flesh stiffened and darkened within days. More bodies meant fresher lessons, and that meant better surgeons. Some professors tried to soften the blow. They would use the same cadaver for several classes, dissecting one arm in January, the other in February, the head in March. It was a patchwork approach, and every student knew it was no substitute for fresh material. Medical advancement had outpaced the law, and as long as the law refused to bend, there was only one way to bridge the gap. Enter the resurrection men. At first, they were not organised gangs, but opportunists, grave diggers who stayed on after dark, workmen with a shovel and a need for coin. They knew the surgeons would pay. No one asked where the bodies came from, not in words that might be repeated. The earliest documented payments for unofficial subjects in Edinburgh appear in the ledgers of the late 1700s. These entries are deliberately vague. One subject, £2, 10 shillings. No name, no cause of death, no details of delivery. And the market was simple. The fresher the body, the higher the price. Some surgeons would even pay extra if the corpse had an interesting wound or deformity, something to make the demonstration more instructive. It wasn't quite the kind of upselling you'd see in a shop window, but the principle was the same. London followed suit. By the early 1800s, certain surgeons became known for their sources, a polite way of saying they rarely lacked for subjects, even when the ropes weren't swinging. And so, by the dawn of the 19th century, the profession of body snatching had taken root. It was not yet the organised industrial trade it would become in the 1820s, but the pattern was in place. A grave dug at dusk, a body delivered before dawn, and a few coins changing hands behind a closed door. This was the foundation, the quiet beginnings of a trade that would soon make the name Resurrectionist known and feared across the British Isles. By the closing years of the 18th century, Edinburgh's Kirkyards had become the first hunting grounds for the sack-em-up men. The demand from the university was constant, the supply from the gallows almost non-existent. And so, the watchmen began to notice small things. A patch of earth that looked too fresh, a boot print where no mourner had passed, or the telltale sag of ground where a coffin had been hastily disturbed and covered again. Greyfriars Kirkyard was a prime target. Its high walls kept the curious out, but also gave cover to those already inside. The lanes that hemmed it in were narrow and twisting, perfect for vanishing with your cargo if anyone called out. A quick dash to Surgeons' Square, and the night's work was over. Canongate Kirkyard, on the other hand, sat more exposed along the Royal Mile, but offered soft, shallow earth and fewer patrols. St. Cuthbert's, sprawling under the shadow of Edinburgh Castle, was perhaps the most brazenly targeted of all. It lay right at the city's edge, close enough to carry a body by hand to a waiting cart. At first, the thefts were almost clumsy. Shovels clanged against stone, thieves were spotted scaling the walls with awkward bundles. A few were caught and fined, though rarely jailed for long. After all, stealing a corpse was not legally theft, since the body was not considered property. It was, legally speaking, a grey area, though grey hardly begins to cover it. If you could dodge the watchman and the law didn't quite know what to call your crime, the risk-to-reward ratio was tempting. By the early 1800s, the sack-em-up men had learned to work in pairs or threes. One kept watch from outside the yard, while the others went in through the soft, fresh mounds. Only the body was taken. Clothing, jewellery and coffin were left in place, again to avoid the charge of theft. The remains were hoisted out with iron hooks, slipped under the arms, wrapped in canvas, and carried away under the cover of night. But word spreads quickly in a city like Edinburgh. By 1804, families had begun hiring guards to watch over new graves for the first few weeks after burial, when the body was most valuable. They built low huts of stone or timber along the walls of the yard, called watch houses. Fires were kept burning inside through the winter nights, and men took turns pacing between the graves with lanterns. St. Cuthbert's still has its watchtower, a stout, round building of stone built in 1827 after years of escalating thefts. But smaller watch huts appeared earlier, improvised by desperate communities. And then came the Mortsafes, heavy iron cages locked over the coffin and sunk into the ground. They were costly, so poorer families often pooled money to rent one for a few weeks until the body was no longer fresh enough to tempt a thief. Then it would be removed and reused for the next burial. A rental service, really, though one unlikely to be advertised in the window of any respectable shop. Even with these measures, the resurrection men persisted. In January 1816, the Edinburgh Evening Courant reported an attempted theft at Canongate, foiled by a passing constable, the robbers slipping away into the winds, leaving their spades stuck in the half-dug earth. A few weeks later, another report described the discovery of a grave where the earth had settled in strange, uneven hollows, the silent signature of a body lifted in the night. These were the years when the game of cat and mouse between the sack-em-up men and the public truly began. And so the contest played on, each side learning the other's steps, a quiet waltz in the graveyard shadows. If Edinburgh was the training ground, London was the proving ground. By the early 1800s, England's capital was bursting at its seams. Over 1 million souls, living and dying in a city whose graveyards were already overcrowded to the point of scandal. In some churchyards, coffins were stacked in layers, separated by little more than a dusting of soil. The smell in summer was infamous. It was said you could stand in Bunhill Fields on a hot day and taste the graveyard air. London's teaching hospitals, Guy's, St. Thomas's, St. Bartholomew's, were thriving, but the Murder Act's restrictions meant they faced the same shortage Edinburgh did. And where there's shortage, there's opportunity. The men who seized it were known here simply as body snatchers, though some newspapers preferred grave robbers, or ghouls. Their methods were much the same as in Scotland, but the scale was far greater. The city was divided into territories. Certain gangs worked St. Pancras Old Churchyard, others haunted Bethnal Green and Whitechapel. Bunhill Fields, with its dense nonconformist burials, was especially profitable. The soil soft, the plots tightly packed. Each gang had an understanding with a particular surgeon or medical school, keeping the supply regular and the questions minimal. It was an arrangement that suited everyone, except, perhaps, the people being buried. One of the most notorious London crews was led by Ben Crouch, a man described in one paper as small in stature, nimble in his work, and untroubled by conscience. Crouch and his men worked fast, sometimes delivering 3 or 4 bodies a night. They even kept a price list. Adults fetched the highest rates, children less, and stillborn infants the least, though even these had a market for midwifery training. The body snatchers in London had to be creative. Some bribed sextons to leave graves loosely covered. Others posed as mourners, following a funeral from a distance to note the burial site, then returning that night. And in a city where police patrols were sparse and lamplight patchy, most could vanish into an alley before anyone gave chase. By 1814, London's Resurrectionists were so organised that rival gangs occasionally clashed at the graveyard gates. These weren't polite disputes. Spades could be weapons as easily as tools. The St. Pancras gang was known to sabotage others by scattering fresh earth over their work, ruining the theft before it could be completed. Of course, not all attempts went smoothly. The Morning Chronicle once reported a botched job at Spa Fields where the thieves misjudged their timing. The coffin they opened belonged to a man dead of smallpox only days before. The body snatchers dropped him in the mud and fled, leaving behind their hooks, sacks, and one very incriminating cart. A rare case where the goods were returned, though not exactly in saleable condition. Yet, for all the dangers, the trade was lucrative. In some months, a successful crew could earn more than most honest tradesmen made in a year. And in the London fog, coin spoke louder than conscience. By the 1820s, the capital's resurrectionists had built a network of contacts stretching from the poorest churchyards to the lecture halls of Harley Street. The work was faster, the risks greater, and the profits higher than almost anywhere else in Britain. It was here, in the shadow of London's spires, that the business of stealing the dead became not just a crime, but an industry. If Edinburgh's kirkyards were cramped and London's burial grounds overcrowded, Dublin's was something else entirely, sprawling uneven fields where history and poverty lay side by side. Bully's Acre, just west of the city near Kilmainham, was the most notorious. It had been a burial place for centuries, the final rest for paupers, cholera victims, and the unclaimed dead. The ground was rough, pitted, and patchy with grass. In some places you could see fragments of old coffins jutting from the soil where erosion had eaten away the covering earth. The name itself, Bully's Acre, was said to come from the brawls that broke out there on burial days, when mourners, drunk from the wake, would clash with each other in the open field. By the early 1800s, the fighting had shifted from the mourners to the corpse lifters. In Dublin, the trade was sometimes called corpse lifting, and those who practiced it lifters or sackers. Their methods mirrored those in London and Edinburgh: night work, shallow digging, the body wrapped in canvas. But there was an added danger here. The Dublin poor were fiercely protective of their dead. Families would post relatives to watch over graves, and in some neighbourhoods, the entire community would take turns patrolling the yard. It wasn't so much that they trusted the law, more that they trusted their own fists. Still, the demand for bodies was strong. The Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin had expanded its anatomy lectures, and the city's medical apprentices needed the same hands-on training as their Scottish and English counterparts. The lifters knew exactly where to sell their subjects and who would pay the most for a fresh one. Bully's Acre wasn't the only hunting ground. Glasnevin Cemetery, newer, more orderly, and wealthier, also drew the lifters' attention. While its stone walls and iron gates were meant to deter intruders, a few coins pressed into the hand of a night watchman could open almost any door. Riots sometimes followed the discovery of a theft. In 1823, a crowd reportedly stormed a medical school near St. Stephen's Green, demanding the return of a stolen body. The lifters had sold it to the school only hours earlier. Whether the professors returned it or simply placated the mob with words was never recorded. There were also darker rumours. Some whispered that certain lifters didn't wait for natural death, that drunken men or the sickly poor could disappear in the night and reappear on an anatomy table the next day. Such tales were never proven, but they kept the streets tense. In Dublin, the corpse lifters often came from the very communities they robbed. Poverty blurred the lines between victim and perpetrator. One week a man might help guard his neighbour's grave. The next, he might be digging up another for the price of a few shillings. It was a city where loyalty was as deep as the grave, and sometimes just as easily opened. By the late 1820s, Dublin's lifting gangs had built a steady trade. They worked in teams, timed their visits for nights when the patrols were thin, and kept their own maps of recent burials. And Bully's Acre muddy, neglected, and full of unguarded graves, remained the place where a sack could be filled faster than anywhere else in Ireland. The Resurrectionists may have done the digging, but they were not the only ones with dirt on their hands. Every lifted body had a destination, and more often than not, it was the back door of a surgeon's school or a hospital anatomy room. The surgeons were the customers, the lifeblood of the trade. Without their coin, the resurrection men would have been just petty grave thieves. In public, most surgeons condemned the practice. They gave lectures on the dignity of the dead. They tutted about disturbances in graveyards. They even claimed to call for tighter laws. But in private, many kept a very different ledger. The entries were simple, almost coy. One subject, £2, 12 shillings. 2 female, fresh. 1 male, noted for fracture of leg. No names, no burial places, nothing that could be tied to a theft, only the clinical shorthand of the trade. Some professors were more brazen. In London there were stories of surgeons who kept the body snatchers waiting in the hall while the previous subject was being cleared from the table, the sawdust on the floor still stained. In Edinburgh, porters at the medical school were rumoured to have standing instructions: never ask questions, and always have coin ready for a man carrying a canvas-wrapped bundle. And really, what respectable surgeon would turn away a perfectly good cadaver just because it arrived without an explanation? There was a strange etiquette to these exchanges. The body snatcher would never say outright where the corpse came from. The surgeon would never ask. Payment was counted out in coins, and the subject was moved quickly into the dissection room, away from prying eyes. Some medical men justified it as a public good. They argued that without bodies to study, surgery could not advance. Operations were already dangerous. A single slip could kill a patient, and practice was the only way to improve. In their minds, the end outweighed the means. Others were simply pragmatic. The law could not keep up with demand, and the gallows could not supply the anatomy tables. If someone else did the unpleasant work of finding bodies, well, it was hardly their place to investigate. But this silence came with risk. When a theft made the papers, or worse, when a grieving family recognized the body of their loved one on the anatomy table, the surgeon's reputation could be ruined overnight. Some kept back doors bolted, lectures cancelled, and public appearances to a minimum after a scandal, waiting for the outrage to pass. In those moments, the surgeons discovered the Resurrectionists' one great gift. They could vanish just as easily as the dead they carried. The relationship between lifters and surgeons was never quite friendship, never quite business. It was something murkier, a partnership built on mutual need, mutual denial, and the quiet understanding that neither could thrive without the other. By 1827, Edinburgh's sack-em-up men were working harder for their coin. Watchtowers had been built, Mortsafes rented, and grieving families were keeping vigil over the newly dead. The risks had gone up, and so had the prices. And then 2 Irish immigrants, William Burke and William Hare, decided there was an easier way to make a living than digging through frozen soil. Hare ran a lodging house in Tanner's Close, a narrow, dim alley in the West Port. It was a place where no one asked questions and few stayed long. In November of 1827, one of Hare's lodgers, an old army pensioner named Donald, died of natural causes, owing £4 in rent. Rather than lose the money, Burke and Hare saw an opportunity. They removed the body from its coffin, filled it with bark to simulate the weight, and sold Donald's remains to Dr. Robert Knox, the city's best-known anatomist. Knox paid handsomely, far more than they would have earned in weeks of honest work. And the seed was planted. At first they waited for the next death in the lodging house, but waiting was slow, and bodies in good condition were worth more than those who had wasted away from illness. So they began to help things along. Their method was simple and silent. One man would pin the victim down, the other would smother them by covering mouth and nose while compressing the chest, preventing the expansion of the lungs. It left no obvious marks, and the bodies appeared fresh, healthy, ideal for dissection. The newspapers would later call it Burking. Over the next 10 months, Burke and Hare are believed to have murdered at least 16 people, mostly women, often vulnerable or transient. Their victims included Mary Patterson, a young woman whose beauty was still remarked upon by students when Knox unveiled her on the table. James Wilson, known locally as Daft Jamie, a harmless street character recognised even in death, and Mrs. Docherty, the final victim whose disappearance unravelled the entire scheme. Each time the bodies were delivered to Dr. Knox's dissecting rooms in Surgeons Square. Knox claimed later that he never suspected murder, but his eagerness to pay and his willingness to accept bodies that were suspiciously free of the marks of illness remain damning in the eyes of history. It's remarkable how blind a man can be when he finds it convenient not to see. The end came in October 1828. Burke and Hare lured Mrs. Docherty to the lodging house, but 2 other lodgers overheard the struggle and alerted the police. When authorities searched Knox's dissecting rooms, they found her body awaiting dissection. At trial, the public's outrage was fierce. Hare turned King's evidence, testifying against Burke in exchange for immunity. Hare walked free. Burke was hanged before a crowd of thousands on January 28, 1829. In one of history's most ironic turns, his body was publicly dissected at the University of Edinburgh, and his skeleton still hangs in the University Museum today. Hare's fate was less clear. He slipped into obscurity after his release, though rumours claimed he was blinded in a lime pit by an angry mob. Dr. Knox was never prosecuted, but his reputation was ruined. Students protested his lectures. The public called for his resignation. By 1831, he had left Edinburgh for London, the shadow of Westport forever at his heels. The Burke and Hare case changed everything. Until then, the Resurrectionists had been grave robbers, not murderers. Now the public saw what could happen when demand for the dead outstripped the supply, and Parliament could no longer ignore it. If Burke and Hare had shaken Edinburgh, the case of John Bishop and Thomas May would rattle London to its bones. By late 1831, the city was still reeling from reports of the Westport murders. Broadsheets sold briskly with lurid woodcuts of Burke's execution, and people whispered in taverns about what might be going on in their own neighbourhoods. On November 5th, 1831, two men arrived at the dissecting rooms of King's College in London with a canvas sack. Inside was the body of a boy, no more than 14 years old, still fresh, his features intact. They had already been turned away from Guy's Hospital earlier. They offered him for sale to the resident porter. The price, they said, was 9 guineas. The porter, perhaps wary of the climate after the Scottish scandal, noted that the body looked far too fresh, the limbs still supple, the skin unmarked by disease. He quietly stalled the men and alerted the authorities. The boy's body was examined by a surgeon who determined that he had not died from illness. The cause of death was clear: drowning. Marks on the skin and water in the lungs told the tale. Bishop and May, both known in the trade as Resurrectionists, were arrested along with an accomplice, Thomas Williams, though some sources mention James Head as well. Under questioning, Bishop first claimed they had dug up the boy from a grave in Bethnal Green. When pressed, he admitted the truth. They had lured the boy to a secluded cottage in Nova Scotia Gardens, offered him drink, and then drowned him in a well. Their motive was simple. A fresh, healthy body fetched the highest price. And, as in Edinburgh, the line between grave robbing and murder had been crossed. It's one thing to disturb the dead. It's another entirely to create them. At trial, Bishop confessed to other murders as well, 2 boys and a woman, all drowned for sale to the anatomists. Whether May was equally involved or simply turned a blind eye remains uncertain, but both men were convicted. On December 5th, 1831, Bishop and Williams were hanged at Newgate Prison before a crowd that filled the streets. May received a reprieve and was transported instead. The public jeered, the newspapers printed every detail, and the fear that had swept Edinburgh now coursed through London. King's College, eager to avoid the fate of Dr. Knox in Edinburgh, cooperated fully with the investigation and distanced itself from the affair. But the damage was done. Within months, Parliament's long-stalled debates on cadaver supply found new urgency. The public would no longer tolerate a trade that not only robbed graves but preyed on the living. And so, with the scandal of Burke and Hare fresh in memory and the horror of Bishop and May still in the headlines, the stage was set for a final reckoning, and a new law that would change the Resurrectionists' world forever. By the time of Burke and Hare in Edinburgh and Bishop and May in London, grave robbing had been a plague for decades. And if the Resurrectionists were inventive, so too were the living. The simplest defence was vigilance. In cities like Aberdeen, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, families hired watchmen to guard fresh graves for the first few weeks after burial, the period when the body was most valuable. These men paced with lanterns, stamping their feet in the frost, musket or pistol at their side. In larger churchyards, permanent watchhouses were built, small stone huts where the watch could take shelter between rounds. St Cuthbert's in Edinburgh built its stout round watchtower in 1827 after repeated thefts. In smaller parishes, the watchhouse might be no more than a timber shack with a brazier burning inside. Then came the Mortsafes, heavy iron cages locked over the coffin and set deep into the ground. Some were elaborate constructions of bars and plates, others simple iron frames. In either case, they made lifting a body nearly impossible without hours of noisy labour. Noise, of course, being the one thing the sack-em-up men could never afford. Because Mortsafes were expensive, poorer families often pooled money to rent one, keeping it in place for a month or so until the body had decayed enough to be worthless to the trade. Then the cage would be removed and passed to the next family in need. In some places, inventors patented burglar-proof coffins. In 1818, George Stephenson of Glasgow advertised a coffin with an iron lining and locking lid, boasting it was utterly impervious to the designs of the Resurrection men. Others went further. Coffins with spring-loaded bolts, lids that snapped shut like traps, even hidden alarm systems with wires leading to a bell above ground. More common in Scotland were coffin collars, thick bands of iron fixed around the neck of the corpse and bolted to the coffin's interior. Even if the Resurrectionists managed to break the lid, the collar prevented them from removing the body quickly. Some communities opted for deterrence by intimidation. In certain graveyards, watchmen kept dogs trained to patrol the burial grounds at night. In others, lanterns were left burning on high poles, throwing light over the fresh mounds. But for every defence, the Resurrectionists found a way to adapt. Mortsafes could be tampered with or lifted out by bribed gravediggers. Watchmen could be paid to look the other way or distracted by a staged commotion outside the gates. Iron collars could be sawed through given time. It was a grim sort of arms race, the dead defended by invention and the living determined to outwit them. Yet these measures slowed the trade and made the work riskier. By the late 1820s, the easy years of lifting from unguarded graves were ending. The Resurrection men had to work faster, dig quieter, and sometimes look for other ways to fill their sacks. And that, as Parliament was beginning to realise, was precisely the problem. By the late 1820s, the resurrection trade was no longer a loose scattering of opportunists. It had structure, hierarchy, and boundaries. In London, certain gangs claimed certain churchyards as their own. St Pancras Old Church, with its heaving mounds and soft earth, belonged to one crew. Bethnal Green was another's. Bunhill Fields, rich in nonconformist burials and easy to work at night, was patrolled by men who would fight to keep others out. Edinburgh's sack-em-up men had similar unspoken rules. Greyfriars was the domain of a small, tight-knit group who knew every gate and wall. St Cuthbert's and Canongate had their own watchers. Not the hired parish watch, but men in the trade who kept an eye out for rivals. Cross those invisible lines, and trouble followed. Rival crews sometimes clashed right in the graveyard, iron hooks and spades in hand. In one Edinburgh account, a watchman reported finding two groups of thieves fighting over a single open grave, the coffin still half buried beneath them. It's worth remembering, in this business the dead were never truly yours until they were in the sack. Informers were another danger. A man caught by the parish constable might buy his way out of jail by naming names, leading the watch to the very men he'd drunk with the week before. Some informers even worked both sides, taking coin from a surgeon for bodies 1 month, and coin from the law for information the next. London's sack-em-up king Ben Crouch was betrayed this way in 1828, when a rival crew tipped off the police about a delivery to Guy's Hospital. Crouch was fined heavily, but the real punishment was loss of reputation. No gang would trust him again. In Dublin, corpse lifters sometimes informed on each other not to the police, but to the families of the newly dead. For a fee, they'd whisper which grave was being targeted, and then watch from a distance as an angry crowd sent the competition running. Double crosses could be deadly. In one London case, a gang lured a rival to an unguarded graveyard, then waited until he was halfway through the dig before alerting the parish watch. By morning, the rival was in Newgate prison, and his former mates had lifted the body themselves. There was honour among thieves, perhaps, but never among resurrectionists. This constant jostling for territory and profit only made the trade more volatile. By the eve of the Anatomy Act, the resurrectionists were no longer just a nuisance to the public. They were a danger to each other, and that instability would help bring the whole trade down. If the resurrectionists feared the watchman's lantern, they feared the printing press even more. By the late 1820s, newspapers and broadsheets had made them household villains. Dreadful violation at Greyfriars, the sack-em-up men at work again, the body snatchers' new atrocity. Headlines screamed from tavern tables and coffeehouse counters. London's Morning Chronicle printed a woodcut of a body snatcher creeping between the stones, sack over his shoulder, his lantern's light catching the grimace of a half-buried corpse. The image sold more papers than any speech in Parliament. Penny dreadfuls took the stories further. Half-truth, half-invention, casting corpse lifters as shadowy ghouls who stalked the living as well as the dead. In some tales they carried smelling salts to revive the nearly gone, only to finish the work themselves. Fact or fiction, it hardly mattered. The public devoured it. And then came the pamphlets, cheaply printed, fiercely worded, passed from hand to hand. Ministers used them to condemn the trade from the pulpit. Reformers waved them in the faces of MPs. Grieving families used them to rally support for stricter laws. The resurrectionists had kept their trade in the shadows for decades. Now the press was dragging them into the daylight, and daylight was where their business could not survive. This constant coverage did what the Watchmen and the Mortsafes could not. It kept public anger at a rolling boil, day after day, until even those in Parliament who had once ignored the problem began to see it as urgent. The scandals of Burke and Hare in Edinburgh, Bishop and May in London, once separate outrages, were now woven together into a single damning story of a trade gone too far. And that story was about to force a change in the law. By 1832, the public had had enough. Years of grave robbery, scandals like Burke and Hare in Edinburgh and Bishop and May in London, and a constant drip of lurid headlines had made one thing clear: the law as it stood could not protect the dead. In Parliament, debate over the supply of cadavers had been dragging on for decades. Reformers had argued for change as early as the 1780s, but they met resistance from those who feared tampering with tradition, or, perhaps more truthfully, didn't want to face the distasteful business of the dissecting room. But now the mood was different. The public anger was not cooling, and politicians knew it. On February 1st, 1832, Henry Warburton introduced a bill that would become the Anatomy Act. Its core proposal was simple: make it legal for licensed anatomists to use the bodies of those who died in hospitals, workhouses and prisons without anyone to claim them. It was a cold solution, but an effective one. No more waiting for the gallows. No more coins changing hands in the shadows of the kirkyard. Instead, the unclaimed dead, mostly the poor, would go straight from deathbed to dissecting table, legally and openly. It did end grave robbing. It also meant the poorest in society paid, quite literally, with their bodies. Supporters in Parliament argued it was a humane exchange, that medical science needed these bodies, and the alternative was the chaos of the Resurrectionists. Opponents called it state-sanctioned theft of the poor. The wealthy and influential, after all, could still secure private burials with watchmen and Mortsafes. The pauper had no such shield. Despite protests, the bill passed on August 1st, 1832. The resurrection trade collapsed almost overnight. No surgeon needed to risk his name buying from the resurrection men when the law now delivered a steady stream of cadavers through official channels. For the resurrectionists, it was the end of an era. Some faded quietly into other work. Others turned to petty theft or smuggling. A few, still young and strong, enlisted in the military or emigrated. The days of digging under lantern light, the long walks through fog with a heavy sack, the whispered knock at the surgeon's door, all of it was gone. The graveyards grew quieter. Not safer, perhaps, but less disturbed. And while the public could finally bury their dead without fear of the midnight spade, another truth settled in. The poor had not escaped the dissection table at all. They had simply been led there by the front door instead of carried in through the back. When the Anatomy Act silenced the resurrectionists' trade, it did not silence their place in the public imagination. In fact, it set them loose to roam in ballads, broadsides, and ghost stories. For years, parents had warned their children to come home before dark with the half-jesting threat: "Stay too long in the kirkyard, and the sack-em-up men will have you before morning." That warning lingered long after the last real body was lifted. In Edinburgh, some claimed to see a figure slipping between the stones in Greyfriars on foggy night. A shadow with a sack over its shoulder, vanishing just before it reached the gate. Penny dreadfuls of the 1830s and 40s turned the resurrectionist into a Gothic stock character. Part villain, part ghoul, sometimes even a comic rogue who always escaped the law. In one, the Sack-em-up of St. Pancras, the hero was a quick-witted thief who stole from rival gangs, robbing not graves but the robbers themselves. Songs and street ballads took a darker tone. The Resurrection Man's Song, printed in London in 1832, began cheerfully enough but ended with the singer on the gallows, lamenting that the rope was the only thing he couldn't lift. It seems even in fiction, the gallows had the last word. Folklore absorbed the trade into older fears. In rural Scotland, some stories merged the sack-em-up men with tales of churchyard spirits, turning them into supernatural thieves who could pass through walls and vanish in a swirl of mist. In Ireland, the corpse lifter sometimes became a kind of bogeyman, said to dig up not for surgeons, but for witches' rituals or dark bargains. Even serious literature borrowed from their legend. Charles Dickens, in A Tale of Two Cities, gave us Jerry Cruncher, a resurrection man, by night, comic in his grumbling, but still unsettling in his work. By the end of the 19th century, most who remembered the trade were gone. But the figure of the resurrectionist, lantern in one hand, sack in the other, remained, drifting between fact and fable. The graveyards were quiet now, but in the mind's eye the spade still bit into the earth, and the sound of footsteps in the frost might still mean someone was at work among the stones. If you walk through the old kirkyards today, you can still find them, relics of a war fought in silence between the living and the dead. In Greyfriars, along the far wall, iron cages still crown certain graves. Their bars are orange with rust, the locks seized long ago, the names on the stones almost worn away. At St. Cuthbert's, the watchtower stands squat and patient, its narrow windows peering out over mounds that have been undisturbed for nearly 2 centuries. In the churchyards of Perth, Aberdeen, and across the lowlands, you can sometimes glimpse the outline of a Mortsafe just beneath the grass, the ground sinking slightly around its edges like the memory of a scar. Most who pass them now don't know what they were for, but we do. In Bunhill Fields in London, the stones are crowded close as books on a shelf, each leaning into the next. Somewhere in that packed earth, the body snatchers once moved like miners through a seam, searching for the richest vein. And in Dublin, the uneven ground of Bully's Acre still tells its history to those who look. Patches where the soil shifts differently under your step, as if the past there has been turned over more than once. These Mortsafes and watchtowers, these iron collars and barred coffins are more than curiosities. They are the last defences of the dead from a time when the grave was not final, when the earth could be persuaded to give up what it had only just claimed. The resurrectionists are gone, their tools rusted, their names mostly forgotten. But their shadow is long. It lives in the ghost stories told to children, in the folklore of the kirkyard, in the faint prickle on the neck when you pass a gate at dusk and think you see someone moving among the stones. And perhaps, as you stand in one of these old graveyards, listening to the wind curl around the stones, you might wonder, if you were to linger here long enough, in that still hour between midnight and dawn, would you hear the scrape of a spade? And so our walk among the graves comes to its end. The trail of the resurrection men fades into the mist, their names little more than footnotes, their tools rusting quietly beneath the weight of years. The Mortsafes stand still, the watchtowers keep their silent vigil, and the earth holds fast to what remains. The Resurrectionists are gone. Yet their story lingers, caught between fact and folklore, waiting in the dark for anyone willing to open the gate. We close this chapter now, the lantern light dimming on iron bars and weathered stones. But the echoes of the spade and the rustle of canvas will be with us, as all true histories are, just beneath the surface,